Okay, I'm back with Chapter 5 of Chris Hedges' The Death of the Liberal Class. I've been moving my way through this book one chapter at a time and just picking the highlights, the parts that I think are the most noteworthy that I want to talk about. I remember back at the beginning in the introduction, in the introductory video about this book, I discussed Hedges' orientation as a Christian anarchist. And it's in this chapter that we get enough discussion of religion to be able to find out more of where Hedges is coming from on that front. So I want to zero in on that a bit in this particular video. He ends up discussing Dorothy Day and the Catholic Workers Movement. He talks about and the need for an authentic Christianity or spirituality. He criticizes much of the contemporary churches for selling out and treating people with pop psychology instead of true spirituality, deifying beliefs on the left and right, or turning them into their religious dogma. In other words, kind of deciding that whatever you believe ahead of time is what your church will believe. So all of this is very interesting. Now, before I do that, I want to just touch on what he says at the very beginning, which I find to be a good summary of where he's gone so far. So he says, as the state was slowly hijacked by corporations, a process that began after World War I, accelerated after World War II, and was completed with ruthless efficiency over the past 30 years, the liberal class purged itself of the only members who had the fortitude and vision to save it from irrelevance. The final phase of total corporate control, which began with Ronald Reagan, saw the steady assimilation of corporate ideology into liberal thought. It meant that the liberal class was forced to discard the principal tenets of liberalism. The liberal class, its institutions controlled by corporations, was soon mouthing the corporate mantra that economics and the marketplace, rather than human beings, should guide political and economic behavior. Free market capitalism, a distinctly illiberal belief system, soon defined liberal thought. I wanted to read that because it really sums up a lot of the thesis of the book about what went wrong with liberalism. We know that it began to be overtaken with World War I. I featured that in a previous video. Here he's saying that with the corporate control of all of these institutions that liberal class used to or could have some voice through, that basically they changed their position to embrace corporate capitalism. But he's saying that free market corporate capitalism is actually an illiberal belief system. So in this way, they've made a mistake and they have embraced something that doesn't fit with the core values of actual liberalism. And this would be because the corporate, if he's correct, then corporate capitalism actually limits people's freedom. Liberalism is a lot about freedom and liberty and self-determination and, also democratic governance, being able to get with other people and actually make decisions about how you are going to live your lives and so on. And so he's arguing that corporate capitalism, embraced by all these people, now on the left as well as on the right, is actually an illiberal force that reduces freedom, that reduces liberty, that takes away people's choice, that makes democracy less effective because people don't really have a choice, or they're manipulated by excessive campaign spending and all sorts of things. He says, by the time the touted benefits of globalization, the belief that workers around the world would become wealthier, that the market would lift the developing world out of poverty, that tearing down trade barriers would benefit citizens from both the developed and the developing worlds, that peace and prosperity would inevitably result from interconnected global economies, were exposed as a sham, it was too late. The liberal class had driven critics of this utopian fiction from their midst. The liberal class was complicit in the rise of a new global oligarchy and the crushing poverty visited in globalization's wake on the poor and working class. There are several examples in here about journalists and academics and other figures who were rejected by the so-called liberal class establishment when they got too critical of the existing status quo, especially critical of corporate power, when they started to point out the amount of dislocation and poverty that it causes, or some other uncomfortable subject, they'd be let go from their cushy positions in academia or in the media. So we've talked about that some before, and he gives some more examples of that type of thing here, where you can't really fit in and have that nice way of life and be a well-respected professional if you go too far outside the mainstream in the area of criticizing what Chris Hedges calls the power elite, or corporate capitalist power. But in a second section, we get maybe to the heart of Hedges, and we get some positive statements here. He says the best opportunities for radical social change exist among the poor, the homeless, the working class, and the destitute. As the numbers of disenfranchised dramatically increase, our only hope is to connect ourselves with the daily injustices visited upon the weak and the outcast. Out of this contact, we can resurrect from the ground up a social ethic, a new movement. We must hand out bowls of soup, coax the homeless into a shower, make sure those who are mentally ill, cruelly abandoned on the city sidewalks, take their medication. We must go back into America's segregated schools and prisons. We must protest, learn to live simply, and begin, in an age of material and imperial decline, to speak with a new humility. It is in the tangible, mundane, and difficult work of forming groups and communities to care for others that we will kindle the outrage and the moral vision to fight back, and that we will articulate an alternative. Well, when you read that, you realize this author is motivated by some sort of spirituality, that this is a statement of belief and of conviction and principles. And he follows that statement immediately with Dorothy Day, who died in 1980, founded the Catholic Worker Movement with Peter Morin in the midst of the Great Depression. The two Catholic anarchists published the first issue of the Catholic Worker newspaper in 1933. And Downaways, he says, the Catholic Worker refused to identify itself as a not-for-profit organization. It never accepted grants. It did not pay taxes. It operated its soup kitchen in New York without a city permit. The food it still provides to the homeless is donated by people in the neighborhood. There are some 150 Catholic worker houses around the country and abroad, although there is no central authority. Some houses are run by Buddhists, others by Presbyterians. Religious and denominational lines are irrelevant. Day cautioned that none of these radical stances, which she said came out of the Gospels, ensured temporal success. They were not practical. She wrote that sacrifice and suffering were expected parts of the religious life. Success, as the world judges it, should never be the final criterion for the religious and moral life, or for the life of resistance. Spirituality, she said, was rooted in the constant struggle to fight for justice and be compassionate, especially to those in need. And the commitment was hard enough without worrying about its ultimate effect. One was saved in the end by faith, faith that acts of compassion and justice had an intrinsic worth, even if these acts had no discernible practical effect. So, wow, that is quite a statement of faith and of principle. And I would say that it sounds a bit like the theology of the cross. I have been reading a bit of Jürgen Moltmann's book on the theology of the cross. And its main message is that Christians oftentimes spend quite a bit of time thinking about the glory of God and sort of equating the glory of God with earthly glory and earthly authority, and they put those two things together and they glorify themselves in a way by building up their power and their efficacy. In the case of churches, that might be the number of people in the pews or how big of a building you have, but also they build up their power through connections with politics and political power. Whether that be the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, or whether it be the Protestant Church now, depending on who happens to be in the White House, but certainly right now with evangelicals. And so Moltmann wrote this book called The Crucified God, in which he tries to delineate the theology of the cross, another way of looking at God, in which God is not just this glorified and glorious, all-powerful figure that we can too easily kind of simplify and emulate, and in fact become like in the wrong way of glorifying ourselves and our power. But God is in Christ this abandoned, emptied, rejected, suffering figure that lets go of everything in order to love human beings, in order to be with human beings in full empathy and compassion. And Moltmann's argument seems to be, if you want to know God, you can see God and be with God in those who are the least among us, and find communion there, rather than in the seats of power, whether that's in churches or in government. So while Chris Hedges doesn't quote Moltmann, I think that there's a theology of the cross lurking behind the types of things he says about the poor. And it's a very old-fashioned strain of Catholic thought, though I don't believe, Hedges is not a Catholic per se, but it's an old strain of Catholic thought to see Jesus in the suffering of others, and also to dedicate one's own suffering and longing and pain to the suffering Lord. So there, even within the Catholic tradition during the Middle Ages, there was this strain that contradicted the sort of glorification of the earthly church. He quotes Dorothy Day here. He says, she said, "What we would like to do is change the world, make it a little simpler for people to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves as God intended them to do. And to a certain extent, by fighting for better conditions, by crying out unceasingly for the rights of the workers, of the poor, of the destitute, the rights of the worthy and the unworthy poor. In other words, we can, to a certain extent, change the world. We can work for the oasis, the little cell of joy and peace in the harried world." Notice that Dorothy says the worthy and the unworthy poor. One of the distinctions that we often make today in America is between those two. The worthy poor is the one who is, doing everything they possibly can and trying to find a job, working as much as they can. The unworthy poor oftentimes has a drug problem or has some sort of mental issue or some, character defect that seems to get in the way of them working. And the unworthy poor may also include the person who isn't financially poor and ought to be able to take care of himself, but for some reason still has a hard time doing it and maybe takes too much from other people. But it's a type of poverty as well, and I think that Dorothy Day thought that to the extent that we were trying to separate those two out, we were exercising our sense of power and superiority, and that perhaps it wasn't really all that important to sort them out, that God sorts people however he wants. And so I think there was a little bit of a sense that people spent too much time on that. Then Hedges ties his commentary about the Catholic workers movement, and maybe we might just go ahead and say what he thinks Christianity ought to be about, back to the problem at hand, which is, in his view, the decline in relevancy and efficacy of these churches in doing this kind of job that Dorothy Day thought ought to be done. He says, the decline of the Catholic Church, traditional Protestant denominations, and liberal Jewish synagogues, institutions that once had a place for radicals, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Abraham Heschel to Dorothy Day to the Berrigans. That's a reference to Father Berrigan and his brother. They were both priests that were kind of akin to Dorothy Day. Was a body blow to the liberal class. These religious institutions, which purged radicals as ruthlessly as their secular counterparts, became as useless as the other pillars of the liberal establishment. So again, here's more criticism of the churches and the synagogues who decided that radicalism, or what they might, radical action and speech was too much for them to tolerate, because they were afraid of driving away butts from the seats. But you'll notice that somewhere back in that commentary, there was this notion that it's not the number of people, but the effect that you have on people, or the connection that you make with people, that's important to somebody like Dorothy Day. This is interesting. He talks specifically about the Unitarians, and he's quoting a Reverend Davidson Lohr, a Unitarian Universalist minister that he interviewed. And basically this guy's message was, well, Unitarians, who are quite liberal, or have been in the past few decades anyway, they had a purpose. They tended to be white. If you've ever been in a Unitarian church, generally they're white. But they had a purpose in identifying with marginalized people. African Americans in the Civil Rights Movement, women in the women's movement, and at a certain point they were basically given the message, we don't need white people to champion us anymore. I just find this interesting from this pastor's perspective. He says this changed in the 1960s and 1970s when Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X didn't want white folks speaking for them and had far more charismatic speakers themselves. Same with the women's movement. Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, Germaine Greer were miles ahead and wanted to speak for themselves. After Stonewall, the gays also spoke for themselves. This left white liberals with no useful role in society. They were welcome to follow the black women, gay leaders, but not to speak for them. When they could no longer speak for anybody, they, and by they I mean the faculties of good humanities divisions and women's studies, started the political correctness movement. The inane brilliance of this was that by inventing disadvantaged groups, nobody could say they didn't have the right to speak for them. And then Hedges adds, by bringing heaven down to earth with the social gospel, religious and political liberals lost any framework that could critique the things they happen to believe. Oh, he's still quoting the pastor. Individual rights have to be balanced by our responsibility to the larger wholes. But why? In the name of what? Few seem to know or care. Cowardice has become one of the identifying traits of moderate to liberal religions. That statement a while back there, by bringing heaven down to earth with the social gospel, maybe needs a little unpacking. Basically, the pastor is saying that when these people began to crusade for political correctness, they were trying to bring a level of perfection to our social interactions that's not possible, and which becomes more or less oppressive in its own right. There's a point beyond which you can't micromanage people's moral life without it becoming oppressive. So when you bring heaven down to earth, that's what you're doing. You're taking the standards of how we would behave perhaps in the heavenly realm and trying to enforce them in your particular place. That's the oppressiveness of what came to be known as political correctness. Well, there's a lot more in this chapter, but I think I'm going to leave it at that. I think I'll have more of a chance to speak about some of the rest of this in the next one, because the next chapter, in a way, continues on the argument. But I did really want to emphasize the spirituality that comes out here. It's a particular kind of Christian spirituality. It's a very serious attempt to be consistent and to and yet at the same time to not be political or politicize religion past a certain necessary point. An acknowledgement that religion, when it's politicized, when it becomes just a wing of a party, becomes a part of the problem. And the thing about Catholic workers' movement and Christian anarchism is this refusal to become so identified with a political party or government. Not to say it doesn't have a political agenda, because it does, in the sense of it's an agenda about changing people and more or less changing social relationships, but not taking the government and political power route. Anyway, I'm done. See you next time. Bye.